Thank you. Can I have Captain James Miller? He's the commanding officer of the Major Crimes Division. And may I have Officer Doherty and Sergeant Matt Mason.
Good evening. This is for Officer Ryan Doherty, Star 1022. On July 20th, 2013, Officer Doherty was assigned to VRT, the Violence Reduction Team. VRT is a modern-day PBTF. It's a plainclothes street crimes unit whose members are assigned to the most dangerous parts of San Francisco every day. On this day at about 10 p.m., Officer Doherty and several members of VRT had received a tip that a gang member with a gun was in the Tenderloin in the area of Larkin and O'Farrell Streets. As the VRT officers drove to the area, they received an update confirming the suspect was standing at the intersection of O'Farrell and Larkin. When the officers were within a block of the intersection, their tip was confirmed when they heard gunshots coming from that intersection. At this point, Officers Doherty and the Violence Reduction Team officers in the car had two options. One, take cover and wait for the shooting to stop, or two, drive into the middle of an active shooter incident and stop the threat before too many people were hurt or killed. So, of course, they chose number two. They chose the option that put their lives in danger in order to protect the public. As you know, as police officers train for active shooter incidents all the time, it's the most dangerous incident we will ever encounter. But when it's real, it takes real courage to act out the training and confront the shooter. Seconds after the gunshots, the officers reached the intersection of O'Farrell and Larkin Streets and saw that there was more than one shooter and realized they had just driven into a gun battle between rival gangs. Officer Doherty, who was seated in the front passenger seat, quickly located and focused on one of the shooters who had a gun in his hand, shooter number one. Officer Doherty saw shooter number one standing in the middle of the intersection, firing at a group of people across the street. As a police car came to a screeching halt, Officer Doherty immediately knew he had to resort to deadly force in order to stop the active shooter. At this point, he drew his gun and fired at shooter number one. At this time, none of the officers knew that the two victims had already been shot by shooter number one. Needless to say, the actions of Officer Doherty broke up a gunfight and sent the shooters fleeing, preventing more victims from being shot. Shooter number one realized he was outnumbered by the officers and took off running east on O'Farrell Street with the gun in his hand. But this incident wasn't over. The VRT officers needed to catch the armed suspect before he shot anyone else. So again, putting public safety first and their safety second, Officer Doherty and the VRT officers chased shooter number one. As they chased him down O'Farrell Street, the shooter and the officers weaved in and out of the pedestrians who were in the way. Within a block, the shooter threw his gun to the ground, and Officer Doherty and Sergeant Sanders took the shooter into custody. As backup units arrived at the initial scene at O'Farrell and Larkin Streets, they found two gunshot victims from shooter number one. One died at the scene, the other was critically wounded. Shooter number one was later booked for the murder and attempted murder of these two victims. Because Officer Doherty showed great courage in the face of an active shooter incident, put his life on the line for the safety of the public, and apprehended a murder suspect who has no place in a free, safe society, he is awarded the Bronze Medal of Valor. Sergeant Matt Mason, Bronze Medal and More Meritorious Award. During the month of October 2013, a series of 8 robberies occurred in the Richmond district in which a group of armed suspects robbed and terrorized their victims by pointing a gun in the victim's face, demanding their phones, money, and wallets. In at least 3 of the 8 robberies, a black Cadillac was seen in the area. The series was assigned to CIU, the Major Crimes Unit, Criminal Investigations Unit. Over the next week, CIU quickly followed several leads, including one from an officer at Park Station, that a similar black Cadillac was always parked in front of an area at Eddy and Scott Streets. Sergeant Mason and other members from CIU conducted several surveillances of the black Cadillac. On November 4th, 2013, at about 6:45 in the morning, while remotely watching the movements of the Cadillac, CIU Sergeant Sullivan notified Sergeant Mason that the Cadillac was back in the Richmond district in the same area of the previous 8 robberies. Sergeant Mason, who was in the area, was off duty but was prepared for the eventual return of the suspects. While the other CIU sergeants were responding from a distance, Sergeant Mason got into his undercover car and was directed to 25th and Fulton Streets. As Sergeant Mason arrived in the area, he saw the Cadillac double parked in front of 700 block of 22nd Avenue. Sergeant Mason began his surveillance and quickly located one of the suspects from the Cadillac, suspect number 1, standing on the sidewalk in front of another person. Suspect number 1's right arm was extended and pointed at the head of a female victim. Sergeant Mason was close enough to see that the victim looked extremely frightened. From his vantage point, Sergeant Mason could not see if the suspect was pointing a gun at the victim, but from his knowledge of the previous 8 robberies and from his training and extensive experience in robbery surveillances and arrests, he quickly and correctly surmised that the suspect was pointing a gun at the victim's head. Sergeant Mason also knew that the victim was in immediate danger, and at any moment, if the desperate robber wasn't satisfied with the victim's cooperation, that this incident could turn deadly. Putting his own life in danger, Sergeant Mason, alone and without backup yet, approached the armed suspect. In an attempt to divert the suspect's attention away from the female victim and an attempt to place the suspect under arrest, he yelled at the suspect. The suspect ran south on Fulton Street with Sergeant Mason in foot pursuit. At this point, he could see the silver gun in the suspect's right hand. Suspect number 1 ran several blocks and turned the corner onto 23rd Avenue. Sergeant Mason lost sight of suspect number 1, but knew he was on the block somewhere. He watched the block for a few minutes and then saw the suspect walk out from behind a bush in front of a house. The chase was on again. This time, suspect number 1 ran onto 24th Street, but on this block, Sergeant Mason noticed a Cadillac with the suspect number 2 driving the block, looking to pick up suspect number 1. Sergeant Mason now had a second threat to deal with. As marked units arrived to assist, the Cadillac left the area. Sergeant Mason directed the officers to 24th Avenue between Fulton and Cabrillo Streets to lock down the block and search for the suspect. Suspect number 1 was found hiding under a car and was taken into custody. Sergeant Mason went back to where he previously saw the suspect hiding and found the silver gun. Sergeant Sullivan coordinated the arrest of suspect number 2 in the Cadillac. With both suspects in custody, Sergeant Mason interviewed the female victim. She told him that suspect number 1 pointed the gun at her face and demanded money. She gave him $16, but suspect number 1 began to pull her towards the street where the Cadillac was double parked. She pulled back. The victim tried to yell for help, but suspect number 1 put his hand over her mouth. She said that during the entire incident, she was afraid that she was going to be killed by suspect number 1. Obviously, Sergeant Mason's surveillance and intervention in this robbery changed the course of what the suspects were initially planning and saved the life of the victim in this case. Sergeant Mason's expertise in surveillance and arrests and his courage to take on an armed robber led to the arrest of 2 very dangerous robbery suspects and the seizure of a gun. Because of the actions of Sergeant Mason, he's awarded the Bronze Medal of Valor and a meritorious award also.
Good job.